Okay, good evening, Stefan, and good morning here. I'm in Los Angeles, and you're in Rome, and we're here to talk about your book Homelands, published by Decca Stories. And for those who don't know who Stefan is, let me tell you, a really incredible journalistic career, starting at a local paper in Paterson, New Jersey, and turning into a career as a foreign correspondent for, among other publications, Business Week, Time, The Atlantic. You've reported from many countries, including China and Iraq, and you've written a book called Forecast, The Surprising and Immediate Consequences of Climate Change. And so your work really reflects sort of an interconnected globe. And in that sense, I think you were the perfect guy to write Homelands, which presents a really radical thesis backed up with some strong reporting. And let me ask sort of the inevitable question. How did you get this idea to not just call for, but actually report out this thesis, which I'll just go ahead and give away the ending here? What you're calling for is a radical leveling of international borders in the name of just being humane.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm calling for, if my background as a journalist always makes me reluctant to use the word calling for, but I guess to the extent that I'm calling for something, it's to treat everybody equal, regardless of what their nationality is, and that we shouldn't let something like where you're born be the most important factor in what your life is like. And how did that come about? I think just traveling. I mean, I traveled a lot through Africa, which is where a lot of the book is based in, for time, in China, in the Middle East. And I think one thing you're confronted with almost constantly when you're in these places is the disequality. And it's not a disequality because of education or anything else. It's often just because of one person is born there and they don't have a lot of opportunities that another person might have. And it's not even opportunities in terms of going to school, it's opportunities in terms of getting just a very basic job. And that kind of gnawed at me, the idea that so many people who were bright and ambitious and wanted to work hadn't been able to reach their full potential. And the more I thought about it, the more the idea kind of blossomed into something I wanted to write about.
As a matter of disclosure, I should say that I was the editor on this piece, and we had talked about the right way to frame it. And you've got sort of a place that the story begins, and I hope I'm not giving away endings, but a place where the story comes to rest. And we begin in Minneapolis. Can you talk about that?
Well, we began in Liberia and end in Minneapolis, but yeah, I framed the story with the encounter of an orphan I met in Liberia who had been adopted by an American family but hadn't yet gotten a visa, hadn't gotten the final clearances, and then actually about 6 years later, I was able to go visit her in Minnesota, where they had managed to bring her, and so I tried to use her experience as an illustration of how important this can be for somebody to have an American passport or a Liberian passport is really the difference between having opportunity and not having opportunity, with a few exceptions on either side.
Yeah, it's sort of a cruelty in a sense, and you went so far to call it a kind of a global apartheid, which I think that's difficult to swallow for some. Can you talk about why that analogy was, in your view, appropriate?
Sure. I mean, I don't try to call it apartheid. What I try to do is show how it's very similar to what happened, especially in the final days of apartheid. And the argument I actually make is to show that when the apartheid regime in South Africa was finally winding down and knew apartheid had to end, it tried to find an alternative solution. Its first choice wasn't let's let Mandela out of prison and make him president. Its first choice was let's find a different way to maintain what we have. And the way it decided to maintain what we have was and they started to do this, carve South Africa up into different countries. And that way, their idea was we'd have a country where the white people lived, and that would be a richer country, and the other countries would be poor countries. They were called homelands, or in it, by the government, or Bantustans by the detractors. But they were made to. The intention was we will replicate the system of immigration that the globe has, and that, according to the South African government, was a good way to maintain the privileges that they wanted to maintain.
The publication of this book comes quite close to the anniversary of the disaster off Lampedusa, in which 350 some people lost their lives in a shipwreck. And they were mainly from Eritrea, is that correct?
Mostly from Eritrea, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And this is an island, Lampedusa, which is closer to Africa than it is to Sicily, and it's sort of viewed as kind of a target, if you like, for people escaping civil conflicts. This is sort of a keyhole into the EU. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, people, essentially the idea is you get on a boat and you try to make it to EU territory and you can claim asylum, and whether you do that in Spain or in Greece or in Italy, Lampedusa happens to be one of the easiest places to reach because it's, as you say, closer to Tunisia or to Libya than it is to Sicily or certainly mainland Italy. And so it's become this place where people aim for, knowing that that's a chance to better their lives. The boat wreck that happened actually a year ago today, we don't know how many people died exactly, but they recovered 368 bodies, 366 from the wreck, and another two that had been floating in the Mediterranean for about a month from another wreck. And I think that's one of the things that's really been obscured with this talk about the anniversary of the shipwreck in Lampedusa, and during the initial days of reporting it, is that this is not an isolated incident. It's something that happens all the time. People who pay attention to the news probably saw the Lampedusa shipwreck and saw that it happened, saw that some 350 or so people died, 366. The the rest of the year, we saw another 350 people die. The death toll is about 700 for the year, and those people
At the
died.
risk of talking over you, I hope I'm not doing that. My screen is frozen here. Can you see or hear me?
I can see and hear you, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, let's pick this up. Let's ignore the technical difficulties and keep plowing on. When Americans think about dangerous border crossings, I think we inevitably think about the U.S.-Mexican border, but the Mediterranean is far more dangerous, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I can't remember the exact numbers for the U.S.-Mexico border. I think it's actually in the thousands. There was recently a report by the International Organization of Migration that looked at how many people have died basically trying to go from a poor country to a rich country, or to trying to make their lives better, since the beginning of the century, so in the last 14 years. And the total figure was about 40,000 people. And I think the vast majority of those were, I think it was 20, or maybe a little bit more than half, 22,000 were trying to get to Europe, to the Mediterranean. I think it was around 6,000 in the U.S., and others were in the Indian Ocean or Sahara Desert or other places where are not quite as deadly as the Mediterranean, but deadly as well.
I mean, that's just incredible to think about. Regardless of how you feel about immigration restrictions or not, it must be acknowledged that the death toll is incredibly high, and that people are taking astounding risks to essentially either flee predation or starvation in their home countries. We're talking about 3,000 people a year in the Mediterranean, from what I understand, or at least that's the number that the UN cites.
3,000 this year.
This year alone, yeah, a very deadly summer. And to put that in context, that's like a 9/11 happening every summer.
Yeah, and at least particularly this summer. Last year was less deadly. This year, because there's been a lot more people trying. I think both because there's been conflicts in Gaza and in Syria, and as we have a lot of people coming from the Middle East, and I think there's also just been somehow more traffic. Tom, another technical issue. I don't know if you're able to see it, but on the left we have a toolbar that has Q&As, and we have a couple questions from Twitter. I don't know if you want to moderate that or if I should just read them.
Okay, yeah. Let me go there here. And yeah, I do see some tweets. Looks like Taylor Swift has joined this conversation. Welcome, Taylor. Let's see. What has changed? Asks a questioner here. What has changed since this 2013 shipwreck, which I should say plays a major role in your book?
Yeah, the shipwreck sparked a big effort to try to save people in the Mediterranean, and so this death toll of 3,000 is despite efforts by the Italian government mostly to try to uh, pull people out of the Mediterranean. Some people actually argue that maybe it's actually increased the likelihood of people wanting to make the trip because they know there's rescuers out there. But uh, but the Italian government after the shipwreck said we can't keep on having this happen, and they launched a big rescue effort. Now there's some discussion whether that rescue effort will continue, whether Europe should take it over. To me, the real answer is not much has changed. So we can keep on rescuing these people, but as some people argue, that could be an incentive for more people to risk their lives. And as long as people are willing to risk their lives, they're going to keep on coming. And I think we need to find a different solution, or at least start thinking about it differently.
All right, here comes a question coming through the Twitter feed that I'll pass on. I mean, short of reading Homelands, which I certainly recommend everyone do, what can the average American or European reader do to exert some good in this sort of slow humanitarian crisis unfolding out there in the sea?
That's a good question. I don't think I've got a very good answer to it. I think what I try to do with Homelands, what I try to do with myself, is just try to reframe the argument. Because as long as we think that people coming here are totally illegitimate, and we don't realize that we have a connection, we do have a global community to some extent. We have linked economies, we have linked cultures, we have linked communications. Uh, as long as we think that people have no right to be here, I think that continues this policy of trying to keep the globe divided and unequally divided by national borders. So I think the first thing to do is
Well,
to start rethinking how what the what the most moral or right way to view this problem is.
all right, let me raise an objection here, which I think is a pretty easy thing to latch onto, and an obvious question. All right, so let's diminish immigration restrictions and then create a more open border policy. Is that not going to put immense strain on the social services of the industrialized countries?
It's possible that it could. Um, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that at least the immigration we've had at the levels we have don't do that. That immigrants are usually younger, they're coming to work, they're not coming to do anything else, and so they're actually paying more taxes than they actually get in services. There are also a lot of studies that show that they don't actually compete usually with native workers, that often wages will go up, even among the most low-skilled native workers. But to my mind, that's almost not the main point. If our well-being depends on keeping people in a situation where they literally struggle to survive, then that may not be the most moral thing. And if there is a strain in our social services, if there are strains in our economy, well, as a globe, when we look at the whole globe and not just our parochial interests, we'll probably all be better off. I think we can
Well,
almost certainly be all be better off.
morality and foreign policy are two concepts which occasionally overlap, but most often not. I think it was Brent Scowcroft that said there are no moral questions, only national interests. And so, let me ask: would this be in the national interest of the EU, the United States,
For the United States.
other
Well,
countries that?
for one thing, I think I would almost put this more in a domestic policy than uh, than foreign policy. But there's an analogy again with apartheid that says maybe it would be. Um, the end of apartheid brought together two groups of very disparate people: the whites in South Africa and the blacks in South Africa and the colored people in South Africa. And essentially, what apartheid was trying to do was keep them apart, in much the
Hmm.
same way that immigration restrictions do too. And if you actually look at the populations between South Africa in the early 90s and the world today, the proportions are very similar. I can't remember these numbers off the top of my head exactly, but it's something like eight black South Africans for every one white South African, and there's about 8 people living in poor and medium income countries as there are to people living in the EU and the US and other rich countries. And the difference in uh, disparity in income is also very similar. Where actually the disparity in South Africa was actually a little bit bigger, if I recall correctly, than what we're experiencing, what we have today in the globe. And everybody predicted or a lot of people predicted that the end of apartheid would have been a disaster, particularly for the white South Africans. And that actually hasn't been the case. Uh,
Right.
Black South Africans after the end of apartheid have done, not all of them, but many of them have done much better. Uh, Someone told me when I was in South Africa over the summer that there are now more black middle class South Africans than there are white South Africans. And white South Africans haven't suffered. Their income has not gone down, it's actually gone up since the end of apartheid.
Well,
So far, it's been that situation, which is analogous to ours, has been a win-win situation.
I certainly agree with you that there's been good economic data, particularly out of the U.S.-Mexican border, that shows that the United States has benefited more from immigration, even illegal immigration, than it has paid out. But let me ask you this sort of cold-hearted, strictly economic question. We're dealing mainly with, frankly, the young and the strong who have the intestinal fortitude to cross the Mediterranean, to cross the desert, and these are the folks you could argue that are most prime to make an economic contribution. If you lower the barriers for everyone, particularly those who are going to be in need of perpetual economic assistance, does that weaken the economic argument?
Well, for one thing, that's not totally true. The people who died in Lampedusa, a lot of them were children, and some of them were infants. Uh, so there are people who are coming in who aren't necessarily of working age. Secondly, I mean, we have examples of this happening already. We have the European Union. We have Romanians going to work in the UK. We had Poles going to work in Ireland. We have the United States. We have very poor states in the U.S. and very poor parts of the U.S. And we have richer parts, and people travel all the time to go to those places. And it's usually the people who have got some sort of advantage of it because of work reasons. But not always. And certainly in the EU, we have talk of people moving for benefits, but I don't think that's proven to be very much the case in the EU. There might be some of it, but for the most part, it's people coming to contribute to the economy.
Here's a question from Twitter. What is the incentive driving the tightening up of borders? Is this nationalistic politics in Europe, Le Pen in France, etc.?
I think it's a very natural response, particularly in times of crisis, to want to close out. People are coming with different cultures, and often, as you say, they can be quite poor, and that can be very frightening for people who don't necessarily think of them as fellow citizens, or sometimes not even fellow humans. That's why I think it's worth our time to think more broadly and realize that they are fellow humans, but also part of an international community. And secondly, what's interesting to me is that often that those two feelings can take place in the same person. The idea that we need to close our borders and keep them out, and the idea that, hey, this isn't fair, these people are suffering and we should take care of them. And I was really struck. In 2011, I reported on some people who had arrived in Lampedusa. And I spoke to one woman in particular, a young woman who had arrived in Lampedusa twice. And I think the first time she had tried to cross, actually the first time she didn't arrive, she tried to cross from Libya. She got in a boat, I think it was 2008 or 2009, and she was stopped at sea, she said, by an Italian ship who at the time had a deal with Gaddafi that, we'll stop them at sea and we'll bring them back to you. And so she was brought back. They thought they were going to be taken to Lampedusa. Instead, they were brought back and pushed onto a boat, a Libyan boat, which brought them back to a Libyan detention center, basically a prison for migrants, under the theory that the EU had a deal with Gaddafi and that they would apply for asylum in Libya instead of Italy. Now, so she lived there for another 2 or 3 years. A large part of this in this Libyan detention camp, which I imagine was not the nicest place in the world to be. And then again, she tried to cross. The war broke out in Libya, and lots of people were fleeing, or the border controls in Libya had fallen apart, and so they're crossing. And she crossed, and this time she crossed, and she was 9 months pregnant. And she arrived in Lampedusa. I guess went into labor either as she was arriving or shortly afterwards, and they flew her by helicopter. The Italian government said, we can't have this woman uh, who's having a baby be in these conditions in Lampedusa. The island was overcrowded. The center there was overcrowded, and they flew her by helicopter and at the government expense put her up under in a hotel or in a shelter for women to be able to raise her child, or at least to be able to be comfortable in the early days. And this was the same government that had pushed her back 3 years earlier. And I think there's this kind of an amazing transformation when somebody becomes not a threat or a migrant or somebody coming to take our jobs or change our culture or sleep in our parks, but becomes a human being. And I think that's what I think needs to be the starting point for trying to find ways of change. The other thing people can do, I suppose, is talk about this more. I know the Amnesty International recently has a report, and they're asking people to petition governments. But I think the first thing to do is to try to reframe the argument in our own heads.
Well, one of the things, while editing your piece, that I found most heartbreaking, to sort of become aware of the mass movement of people around the globe, and those who stay in their home countries, and who pay the price for it, is just the wasted human potential. These folks who are crushed under malfunctioning economic systems, whose time and resources are squandered on civil conflicts. If they were given a decent education and given a job where their potential might be realized, what are we as a globe losing through this? That's what I found really most intriguing about your thesis.
Sure. You can think of the immigrant that is able to start a company and whether it's a pizzeria or an internet company and make the economy much richer. But you can also just think of a janitor. If someone's making $2 a day cleaning in Lagos, Nigeria, and can come over here and make many times that, that's nobody's being forced to pay that wage of the many times that. That's an economic benefit to the world and to the society he comes to, and often and obviously to him as himself and to his family. So he can then send his kids to school. He can send money back home, even without necessarily thinking of the transformative effect that immigration has had in a place like the U.S. You can say that there's a net advantage to both the host and to the person who's traveling in immigration. Tom, I seem to have lost you.
Well, are we back?
You're back. Yeah, I see you again.
Okay, good. Sorry, there's a freezing issue going on over here. I apologize for that. At the risk of being too high-flown and poetic here, it's like that line from Thomas Gray's poem "Elegy Written in the Country Churchyard." Full many a flower is born to blossom unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air. Could there be tremendous technological innovation? Perhaps the fabled cure for cancer. Perhaps that guy is now cowering under machine gun fire in Syria, or perhaps that guy's sons or daughters, who could make a tremendous contribution if they only had access to good education. That's again the heartbreak of thinking deeply about your thesis.
Yeah, no, I think that's part of it. I think other part of it is just one person's life being a lot better, or many people's lives.
And the total unfairness of that. The total unfairness. We can sort of blame God or nature for that in some sense, but could a shift in international policy do something about that? And actually, let me transition from that into a question, again, coming over the Twitter feed. A user here from, I believe, Thailand has asked, what can the United Nations High Commission on Refugees do about this, if anything?
I would like, I don't know if this is the job for the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, but I would like people to start talking about economic migration the same way they talk about political asylum seekers. Refugees, the whole idea of the refugee was accords was that Europe in particular realized that there were people in terrible straits. This was, I think, during the wars or during World War II. My history is not great on that particular point, but essentially it was a humanitarian response. There are people who are suffering; they're being persecuted for political beliefs or for their races, and we should automatically let these people in. We should bring them no matter what the situation is, and that's still what the policy now. If you're being persecuted because you're part of a group, whether it's politics or race or ethnicity, or then you can apply for refugee status. But that's not the only thing that's painful for people. It's not the only thing that holds people back. A lot of these countries, especially the very most poor countries in the world, people are suffering terribly just simply because they're not able to go to a richer country. The life expectancy in Nigeria, I believe I wrote it down here somewhere, is 52 compared to 83 in Italy. So that person, whether they're being persecuted for these are the average Nigerian, whether they're being persecuted for political beliefs or not, lives 30 years less than the average Italian. And I think we should start talking about that as political cases.
All right. Another question, sort of synthesized here from Twitter. Is there any nation on the globe, to your knowledge, that exhibits the type of policy that you'd like to see? I mean, do we have a model for this?
I can't think of one off the top of my head that's doing it now, but we do have a model for it. We have the United States in the end of the 19th century. There were no passports back then. There were no immigration controls. There was only disease controls. And the people responsible for making the list of people who are arriving were the shipping companies. And that was a time uh, of a great amount of worry. And are these immigrants, these new people coming to our shores, are they changing our society? Are all these German speakers ever going to learn English? Are these Italians going to be criminals? And we know what happened. The United States spent the 20th century as one of the best performing economies in the world. And all the worries that people had about losing our character or crushing our economy or overwhelming our social systems or whatever it was never came to pass.
I agree with that, but there's a missing element to that, which is the tremendous hunger in the United States at the time for Germans to go, settle farms in lands opened up by the railroad. There was a voracious need for industrial labor, which these immigrants, very conveniently provided. In an information-based era that's not agrarian, that is largely, well, this is a generalization, but certainly our need for industrial labor is not what it used to be. Are the same economic drivers of immigration still present as they were in 1890s New York City?
Well, I think if people want to come, they're coming for work to begin with. And as you point out, it's not just the farms in America, it was the cities in America that benefited and boomed and assimilated these immigrants. To be honest, I don't want to try to answer a question I don't know the exact answer to, but I think for me, the way I tend to think about it is that people aren't traveling to where there's no work, they're traveling to where there is work. We saw that during the crisis recently, where immigration flows either stopped or reversed in some cases to Europe and to the United States. And so, as long as there's a demand, people will come, and when there's no demand, there isn't. And as long as there's a demand, then it's economically advantageous for both parties.
Here's a question again from Twitter. And while motivations are going to be complicated, I wonder if there's any way to discern if those fleeing to the EU and to places like Lampedusa are doing so to escape civil conflict, as they are in Libya and Eritrea, or are they just simply seeking economic opportunity? Is there any way to suss that out?
My guess in both, in many cases, is both. Certainly, civil conflict is a big driver. Syrians are coming in unprecedented numbers, and they're not. It's not because they've all of a sudden have better jobs in the EU. That's because of civic conflict. I think Eritrea as well. But I think a lot of people are coming for economic reasons, and I think justifiably so. It's a desire to make a better life for you and your children, and I think it's a very strong driving factor, and it's a justifiable one and an important one.
Hmm. Another Twitter user wants to know actually a very simple question. You, of course, traveled to Lampedusa to report this story. What is that place like?
It's an amazing little place. It's a place that was completely denuded of trees, so it's this not very large slab of kind of limestone rock and small bushes, and it has on it this fishing village of a few thousand people. And in the summertime, it's a tourist attraction. TripAdvisor listed one of its beaches as being one of the best, as being the best in the world. And at the same time, you have this population of very transitory migrants who are arriving, usually spending a few days there. At least in theory, they're only supposed to spend a few days there before being brought to the mainland uh, in Italy and processed there. And so you had, at least when I was there a little bit after this boat wreck, and, a month or two later, and it was the only people I saw really were kind of older Italian, uh, kind of sitting on this on the fronts of their houses or whatever, and these kind of very thin East African men going around in the tracksuits they were given at the center. Um, and the center itself you have to have permission to go in there. I didn't. I actually went there before it was open, but didn't go in there this last time. But it's open to the side of the detention center, so people can leave it. They can't go anywhere because they can walk around town, and so they climb out and sit on the slopes and take the sun, or go for a walk around town, or go to the church because sometimes the church has things they could do for them, help them get a coat or clothes or shoes.
So is that the finish line for these folks? I mean, like when they hit the shores, are they home free in the EU, or is there a complicated path to citizenship, so to speak?
Well, it's complicated. It's very complicated. Just speaking about the asylum seekers, when they hit the EU, they can claim asylum, and they can claim asylum in Italy. And the EU has, uh, I think, a very dysfunctional system where they made an agreement that each country had to agree that when the migrant wherever that migrant arrived, that's where they can claim asylum. So a lot of these people are coming. They have family maybe in Sweden or in the UK or in France, but they land in Italy and they have to claim for asylum there. And after that, they'll either try to move on or they won't, or sometimes they won't have a valid asylum claim, and so um, while they're waiting for their claims to be processed, they'll disappear and either end up on the streets in Italy or try to cross the border somewhere else.
All right, so there is a documentation process. You need to present convincing proof that if I stay in Libya, I would have been killed. If I stayed in Eritrea, Syria,
It's
it's not just
it's
simply showing up and getting
no
in line.
often I haven't seen the spoken to people about it in Europe. I've spoken to people about it in the United States, and it's a testimony thing, and you're supposed to testify to what experiences you've had. So it's a big problem for, say, people who've survived torture who actually have a very valid claim, because sometimes that very testimony can trigger flashbacks, can make them freeze up. I remember speaking to a group in Minnesota that was counseling people who suffered from torture, and a problem that a lot of people had is they didn't want to relive those experiences. And when they had a few minutes in front of of an immigration judge, they would often behave in a way that looked like they were lying. They wouldn't answer with details. They would clam up and not look at the floor. And so these people who had very strong claims, because of the impact of those very strong claims, sometimes weren't able to make their case as well as they could have.
An important point that came up during the editing of this story was that the majority of refugees, either economic or political, really do not want to be refugees. That Syrians really want to stay in Syria for the most part. Most Mexicans or Hondurans, really are at home, where they grew up, and that the dislocating process of moving to a society where you don't know the language, you don't know the food, you feel sort of disassociated from your home culture. Some of us enjoy that, but most don't.
Yeah, we don't have to look at immigration from Africa or from Central America to see that. We can see that in the EU. The EU has had, totally open borders for the most part within it for a long time now, and then the Italians certainly aren't necessarily eager to go work in Germany, and the Greeks don't really want to go work in the UK. I mean, they will if they have to, and they have in recent years because they've been economically almost forced to. But their first choice is to stay home, stay with their family, stay with the culture, stay with the food that they like and the towns that they know. It's a natural. I think as Americans, we're maybe an exception in that case, that we're a very mobile culture. But for the most part, people want to be in the. Well, we're mobile within the United States. I don't know if we're that mobile in terms of being so eager to pick up and move to a foreign country, even if that foreign country is Canada. Um, but within the United States, we move a lot. But I think, yeah, most of the time people want to stay where they with the people they know and where they know, unless they have a good reason not to.
Right. Well, let me before we start to transition out, sort of ask one sort of final devil's advocacy question here. You make a very strong humanitarian and moral and even economic argument, but a reader of your piece might say, well, Stefan, you're sort of singing kumbaya here, expecting there to be open borders and ice cream in Minneapolis for everyone, and that realities are far more complicated than that. Can you answer that objection, that hypothetical objection?
Well, I mean, I did a bit before. Like I say, there's a very close economic parallel between our situation now and apartheid South Africa, and every time we've had the ending of a big inequality, whether it's apartheid in South Africa, whether it's the end of slavery, there's people who lose and there's people who win. But if the moral case is compelling enough, we should be doing the right thing. And in this case, not only is the moral case compelling, but there's a lot of evidence to show that it might not be kumbaya, but it's not going to be the apocalypse either.
All right. I want to take care of this Twitter question by talking about, again, the framing device that you used in this story. I believe her name, refresh my memory, was it Patrice?
Patience.
From, pardon?
Patience.
Patience, pardon me. Patience from Liberia, who you met in Monrovia, and then in very different circumstances later as she was resettled in Minnesota. And so I want to ask about others that you may have met who were resettled. Their emotional state, their physical well-being. Can you talk about those others?
People who were resettled, or people who I met in Liberia who weren't resettled?
Yeah, no, people who were in transition or were making the sort of difficult step of going to places like Lampedusa.
Yeah, I think these people are taking a huge gamble with their lives, literally with their lives. I think the figure is about, of the people who try to cross the Mediterranean, 1 in 50 die. Now, if you told me tomorrow that I had to get on a plane and I had a 50% chance of that plane going down, I would not be very eager to go on that plane. And yet when they arrive, it's not that they arrive and they're, this one woman I spoke to was helicoptered to a shelter, but for the most part they're not. They're being brought to a center, they're being fingerprinted, they're staying in very uncertain conditions. Maybe they get a phone card to call home, and then they're essentially just let out. And even if there wasn't all that bureaucracy or anything else there, they're starting literally with probably not even the clothes they had on their back. They might have family or friends that are helping them with money from other parts of Europe or maybe even from Africa, but it's starting totally afresh. And I think what I find so frustrating is it doesn't have to be that way. Yes, it is utopic to think that we could have a world where immigration wouldn't be so difficult. But I mean, I met these 2 Eritreans when I was in Lampedusa this last time, who had spent, I think it was 2.5 years and $10,000 each to get to Lampedusa. And they had crossed the Sahara in these overloaded trucks and risked their lives there. They had crossed the Mediterranean and risked their lives there. They had been beaten in Libya. They had been extorted in Libya. And if there was a better way, and maybe it's not possible to do it all and have open borders immediately, maybe that's not even the best solution, but if there was a way, and I think actually one thing that has changed since the shipwreck is that people have started to talk about this, that there needs to be better ways of even economic migrants finding their way to the United States or to Europe, a place where they can apply and get there. But just think of that, $10,000. that buys a lot of English lessons or Italian lessons. That buys, quite a bit of time in an apartment while you find work. It doesn't have to be the situation where you arrive, literally in somebody else's shoes now because you don't have your own anymore, and having risked your life. That money could be spent in a different way rather than giving it to human traffickers and making people waste years and months of their lives. It could be done in a much more humane and sensible way that again allows what is in the end an economic transaction to take place. You know,
Yeah, well, I mean, the world has always been full of mass human movements. Certainly, the Jewish and Christian scriptures are full of admonitions to be kind to the stranger in a foreign land. Islam famously puts a premium on hospitality, and sort of with that in mind, a Twitter user wants to know that the Pope, or wants to point out that the Pope visited some of the Lampedusa refugees, and wants to know if the pontiff has any sort of moral authority bringing to bear here.
sure. He met with the survivors of the shipwreck. I believe it was yesterday or the day before. And actually, before the shipwreck, he visited Lampedusa itself and gave a sermon there where he very much urged the world to see the people who are arriving as brothers. I'm glad to see somebody of his moral authority speaking about that, and I think it has made a big difference in Italy. Um, uh, and I hope him and other people like him keep on banging this drum.
Very good. Well, we're close to the end of our time here. I wonder if I could just sort of throw it open and ask if people take away one thing from your amazing book, Homelands, and take away anything from this 1 year anniversary of this shipwreck, which, as you point out, only symbolizes the far greater sort of constant disaster unfolding in the Mediterranean. What one thing is that?
To rethink how we do things, uh, and if that means that may not mean ending all border controls or making immigration free, but I think we need to at least start from the basis that we're living in a society that's made unequal by our immigration policies, and we need to start thinking what that means.
Very good. Well, I found your book tremendously thought-provoking and challenging of established orthodoxies, and so I congratulate you on it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right.
That was fun.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for listening, everyone.